Right. Um, Morning, everyone. I trust that you are well. Welcome to our webinar. I just want to make a quick announcement of gratitude to the Climate Justice Coalition for making this possible. It's been quite a lot of time in preparation for this webinar. Um, and Thank you everyone for taking your time to join us. You might want to drop a message in the chat and just introduce yourself and let us know where you are joining from. As you know, the climate crisis is genuinely upon us, and I'm sure we have seen the recent flooding, the way it caused disruption and the loss of lives. And the concern really is the ability for the country to have enough resources to ensure that there's a true just energy transition, and also to ensure that there's climate justice. We are also concerned about the skyrocketing debt that has reached over 75% of GDP. And we see that it is becoming really unsustainable. So this webinar is on international financial institutions, debt, and the impact on climate justice. Some of the major objectives that we have are that we want to have a general understanding of what international financial institutions are, what their operation looks like, and their role in the South African public finances. And we also hope that we can shed more light on the recent and future decisions around international financial institutions, borrowings, and the impact on the ability to achieve climate justice. And we also hope that we can discuss what actions that are needed to ensure that international financial institutions do not impede on achieving climate justice. Um, I'm hoping that for all the participants, you can be on mute. If you have any comments, you might want to drop in the chat, but we are going to entertain the questions and also have a bit of discussion after the presentation. My name is Brighton Phiri. I am a climate finance activist, and today we have Liso Mdutyana. He's a junior researcher from the Institute of Economic Justice on debt and budget policy. I'm going to allow Liso to just introduce himself before we can start the presentation. Liso, over to you.
Thanks, Brighton. I think you've done all of the introduction that's necessary. There's not much more to know about myself. This is pretty much it. Just a junior researcher on debt and budget policy at the Institute for Economic Justice. And of course, as you have correctly pointed out, the issue of debt is linked to the issue of climate justice. And basically, the point of the webinar, if we have moved on to the second page, I hope. So the point of the webinar is to try and draw that link, I think, more clearly. How does climate justice link to fiscal policy? A fiscal policy which encompasses issues of how the government spends towards its objectives, and how it raises the money that it spends, through taxation, through debt. And the particular issue we want to focus on as it pertains to debt is the government's recent borrowing from international finance institutions. We want to look at precisely what it will mean for climate justice. Because I think we believe having a better understanding, of which decisions and which decision makers impact on climate justice can strengthen our advocacy. It can allow us to pinpoint where are the points of contention, who are the actors which we should look at and whose operations we should be careful of as we advocate for climate justice. So basically, in this webinar, we'll be trying to answer three main questions. We'll be also looking at other things, but we will be focusing on these three main questions. So the first is, why has South Africa resorted to borrowing from international finance institutions? How does borrowing from these international financial institutions affect our lives on a day-to-day basis? And the third is, what would continued borrowing from these international finance institutions mean for our ability to respond to the impacts of climate change and on building resilience as we are tackling the climate crisis? So that's basically the point, to draw the link more clearly. And this is just an overview of the discussion. So we'll have six main sections. The first is to just define climate justice a bit more precisely and how it links to economic justice. The second is to look at IFIs and what role they are playing in our fiscus, and why South Africa has then resorted to borrowing from them. The fourth will be to look at what implications this will have for climate justice as we see it. And then the fifth will be to look at what it will mean for building resilience, while the last will try to look at what are the opportunities for change. So what can we do, or what should we be advocating for? And this is something I'm hoping will be an open discussion, because there will be different perspectives on this. So the first is to try and think about what we mean by climate justice. So a lot of organizations will obviously have their own definitions, their own conceptions of this topic. But for us, it's generally an approach to dealing with the climate crisis that recognizes the historical and current injustices, which makes different groups in society have different vulnerabilities to climate crisis, and a different capacity to deal with the climate crisis. So we are trying to say here that, as much as a climate crisis is a phenomenon worldwide, sorry for that, is a phenomenon worldwide, um, it is not the case that all of the groups within a society are able to deal with it equally. It is not the case that all groups within a society have the capacity, the means to deal with the climate crisis that is ongoing. So, a climate justice then advocates for solutions that account for the fact and recognize that the development of the global capitalist economy has been achieved through these ways. It has been achieved through land dispossession and displacements of its societies. We can speak about it more concretely. In South Africa, we know it has meant that a large part of the African population has been relegated to the outskirts of cities, has been cramped in and concentrated in areas that are not necessarily advantageous for living. We know, again, the development of the global capitalist economy has been achieved through the creation of a working class. So a group of people that have, no means to survive on their own, and the only thing that they can really do is to sell their labor for a wage in order to survive. And lastly, the development of the global capitalist economy has been achieved through the destruction of the natural environment. What all of this has meant is that it has created inequality. in terms of access to resources and the distribution of resources, as well as, access to basic needs, which include land, which include water, which include energy, food, and housing. So the climate justice approach then recognizes that this is the starting point when you want to think about how do we deal with the ongoing crisis. And then secondly, the second element of it is the recognition that while climate change is happening worldwide, the responsibility for causing it is not equal. So industrialized countries, so the countries that industrialized first, such as countries in Western Europe, Great Britain, Germany, then countries in North America, the US, Japan, and also the countries that have industrialized recently, like China, they had a disproportionately larger negative impact on the environment. So what does that mean? For us, it means these countries should then contribute more in driving the global transition to cleaner energy, cleaner and renewable energy. And we can talk about what that means in concrete terms. So that's basically how we try to think about a climate justice. And then just to remind ourselves, so climate change, it brings about these extreme and less predictable weather events such as heat waves, droughts, floods, heavy rainfall, as well as changes in the ecosystem. So, for example, if farms might at some point have had animals that are contributing to growing plants, but because of changes in the weather patterns, it might be the case that those animals might migrate to different places, and all of this is obviously a threat to our well-being. And so adapting then to this climate change will require economic justice because economic justice entails a more equitable distribution and access to economic resources and basic needs. And what it means in concrete terms is that people are able to reside in land that is in suitable areas with proper, dignified housing. In the event of heavy rainfall that typically can bring about floods, people need to be in places where they will be shielded from the effects of that heavy rainfall or heat wave. People must have access to food and must have food systems that are resilient. So what we mean by this is that because there will be these extreme weather events that are at some points unpredictable, it must be the case that our food systems are resilient. So, for example, we might have a buffer stock, so that is, we are able to keep away food surpluses in food stored, so that in the case that, for example, the agricultural areas that we depend on to farm are not able to produce because of these weather events, people are still able to get food. The third is quality, durable public infrastructure. Again, we know that when heavy rainfall happens, if for example you do not have the requisite drainage systems, your roads are poor, your bridges are poor, you will have collapses in roads and bridges, and you will have flooding, which again will threaten the well-being of people. And then lastly, the point we want to touch on is that workers that are directly or indirectly involved in industries that depend on or that supply fossil fuels. So that would be industries such as coal mining, that will be industries such as car manufacturing, are adequately reskilled so that they can be able to maintain their livelihoods as these industries kind of die down and we move on to different industries. It must be the case that workers are still protected from that effect. So the point we are trying to make here is that if you are to deal with the climate crisis in recognition of these historical and current injustices, then you need to have economic justice. So that's the point. So that's what we want you to take away from this. And then moving on, how we try to integrate a fiscal policy is to then recognize that these international finance institutions in South Africa and in many parts of the world are the one that have been financing this climate transition. So financing projects linked to renewable energy, financing projects that are linked to the reskilling of workers in order to enable them to transition to these different industries. But we wanted to define them more properly so that we know what we are talking about. So international finance institutions are organizations that are formed by one or more countries. So in general, their point of existence or their mandate is to provide finance and technical assistance, which may be in the form of advice on fiscal policy issues to governments. And all of this is for developmental purposes. So you would know some of the international finance institutions. They include the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, French Development Bank, and the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank. So we focus on them because IFIs are playing a key role in public finances of developing countries. Um, so even before there was this much worldwide focus on the climate transition, international finance institutions had been providing debt, especially to developing countries that have difficulty in accessing international capital markets. So countries that, for example, may need foreign currency in order to import goods but are not able to borrow from the market because the interest rates are too high. So they've kind of tried to rely on institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF for that credit. And we see in South Africa that international finance institutions are the main source actually of the Just Energy Transition Partnership financing. So
Liso,
South Africa has, yes, yes.
let me just pause for a second there. I just want us, is it possible if, okay, we would have a question to say, um, international financial institutions, what makes them different from commercial banks? Because someone could have a question to say, what makes them unique? I know you mentioned the issue of ownership, but can you dwell a little bit more on that before you get to financing the climate transition?
Thank you so much. Aside from the ownership, which you said these are institutions that are owned by countries, one factor that makes them unique is that one factor which makes them unique is that their mandate typically is to be developmental. So by design, they should be supplying funds for the purposes of development. So that's how they differ from commercial banks. Commercial banks being institutions which are basically out for profit. So by contrast, international financial institutions, which are sometimes called multilateral development banks or bilateral development banks, their purpose is to be developmental. The second thing is that um, i- in contrast to commercial banks, they are they are explicitly political institutions. And what we mean by that is that their mandate is shaped typically by the internal politics of countries. So, for example, the French Development Bank will reflect the politics of, for example, the country of France, or the German Development Banks will reflect the politics or the international outlook of the country of Germany. Um, Another aspect is that, and I will use here the example of the World Bank and the IMF, it's that there is a the, their interests, the interests of these international finance institutions tend to be dictated by by which countries dominate within them. So in the World Bank, for example, and in the IMF, the decision-making power is towards the Western countries such as the United States and Europe, and they have the power to dictate where finances go, what finance will look like in terms of uh, how much of it there is and what interest rates are charged. So I would say, yeah, that those are the three, main differences I would point to between e-commercial banks and international finance institutions. Brighton, do you want to come in again?
Yeah, okay, just as an addition there, um, when we are talking about development and developmental projects, what sort of projects are we talking about when we say these institutions focus on developmental projects?
So it kind of differs because lending by these international finance institutions can really be divided between what is typically called project lending and what is typically non-project lending. So a project lending will, for example, be for a singular project, something you can look at and point to. So an example of this might be the building of a dam that will allow, for example, the supply of electricity, and that will allow for the supply of water. So that is project lending, and it's obviously something that is developmental because it is something that is likely to have a positive impact on economic development in the country. But they also lend what is called non-project lending or general budget support. So they will give money to a country, um, and it is hoped that the country will use that money for developmental purposes. So the country might, for example, spend on education, might spend on healthcare, might spend on social grants. So those are the different kinds of developmental lending that these international finance institutions typically engage in.
Great, you can move ahead.
Thank you, thank you. So as we've said, these international finance institutions are a main source of financing the just energy transition in South Africa, which is basically the government's plan to sort of decarbonize the economy. And they have already lent over 200 billion since 2020, and are intending to lend upwards of 250 billion in the next 3 years in South Africa in order to advance South Africa's climate transition plans. And Sorry for that. And in uh, and in general, international finance institutions can be a viable source of public finance, as we have noted. They are able to provide finance at a price or interest rate than which is lower than what is available on the market. And this can be, very advantageous for countries that face high borrowing costs if they were to borrow money from the market. Also, these international finance institutions are able to provide finance in times of crisis, even where the market has stalled and doesn't want to supply money and doesn't or supply it cheaply. International finance institutions are able to then come to the table and say, okay, we will borrow you because you cannot get money otherwise. Uh, but a typical problem that we face with these international finance institutions is that they almost appear unaccountable to anyone. So even where they, they are wrong in their lending, and it's something that we will talk about in greater detail, or lending for projects that are problematic or have impacts problematic, they do not seem to get any kind of sanction or punishment. The second is that they are not really transparent in their lending. And what we are referring to here to is that typically, as the public, we are not able to get information about the projects that these international finance institutions are lending to, or we are not able to get information about the financial details or the policy conditionalities that is attached to the lending that is done by these international finance institutions. But they can be a viable source of public finance if they are able to provide on concessional terms. So if they are able to give countries grants and less of loans, countries that are already in financial distress, if they are able to give them grants which they do not have to repay. So, and if on loans, they are able to provide the interest rates that are far lower than what would be available on the market, which will help the country reduce its repayment costs. Or if they are able to provide a domestic currency to the country. But even in its viability, it's important to note that debt financing must consider debt sustainability. So when these international finance institutions lend to this country, they must not only consider whether the country is able to repay back the loan that it has lent to them. They must consider whether the country, in repaying back the loan, is still able to spend on socio-economic objectives, such as education, such as health, such as social protection. And then lastly, even if they are viable, we believe there should be mechanisms that are put in place for countries that may, for example, fall into debt distress, and are unable to repay back. There must be mechanisms put in place for that country to be able to restructure its debt. So what that might look like is that the international finance institution writes off that debt and says, okay, you no longer have to be able to repay this debt. Or if we lent you 500 million, you should only be able to pay back 100 million. Will reduce your burden of debt. And for South Africa, the reason that they have really went back to international finance institutions is because these IFIs are a source of relatively cheap finance for the country. So, South Africa, as we'll know, failed to recover the levels of economic growth that it saw before the global financial crisis and the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. So what happened then in the 2010s, lower than expected economic growth created a sizable gap between what the government receives and what it spends. So it led to growing budget deficits. And while that happened, credit rating agencies also downgraded South Africa's bonds, meaning that they believe South Africa has now a higher risk of possibly not paying back money that it borrows from investors. And this contributed to higher interest rates and has made it more expensive for the government to borrow on the market. Um, in addition to this, then there was the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to further increases on interest rates on government bonds. So it has become very expensive for the government to borrow. And not only that, it has also become expensive and costly for the government to repay back the loans that it has taken. So what our government chose to do then around 2020 is to go back to these institutions, and it tapped into the IMF, it tapped into the World Bank, which at the time, which was during a period of crisis, offered interest rates which were far lower than what was available on the market. They also offered what are called grace periods. So a grace period would really be these international finance institutions allow South Africa to not repay back the loans immediately, but to start repaying them back, let's say after 5 years. And then since 2020, borrowing from these institutions has continued. And this has mainly been to finance the just energy transition, again, which revolves around South Africa trying to shut down or at least reduce its use of the coal-powered stations and to much more increase the use of renewable energy stations. Um, and now we want to kind of look at what borrowing from these international finance institutions mean for us, the general public, and for our day-to-day lives. So one thing that is particular about international finance institutions, in contrast, for example, to commercial banks, is that when they lend, and in contrast to borrowing from the market, when they lend, they typically attach what are called policy conditionalities. And these policy conditionalities are basically these international finance institutions basically trying to instruct the government or the country as to what policies it believes the country should undertake in order to, let's say, further develop or to stabilize the economy. And this is obviously a threat to national sovereignty because uh, policies of the country are things that should be decided internally, are things that should be decided with consultation to the public, whether that be labor, civil society, and other groups, or things that are determined by parliament. And but when we take on these loans, part of what comes is the conditionalities, and these loan contracts are legally binding. So we have to adhere to these conditionalities. We must follow through on the policy promises we have made in taking on these loans. And then the problem typically is that many of these international finance institutions are part of or are in support of the neoliberal economic agenda, which is the belief that the best tool or the best mechanism for distributing resources within the economy is the market. So things must be provided by the market, resources should be distributed through the market, and the state must be as minimal as possible. The state doesn't need to be large and try to provide everything like electricity, like water. Those can be provided by the private sector. So typically, these institutions are in support of that agenda. And this is reflected in the conditionalities that they attach to the loans that they give us. An example we can look at are the two loans the government took in 2020 and in 2022. So this was following the COVID-19 pandemic. So in the IMF loan, the government had to sign a letter of intent in which it committed to fiscal consolidation, that is cutting the budget because we are at a high level of debt. Similarly, in the World Bank loan, one of the conditions is that the World Bank must be happy with our macroeconomic policies. And the policies, of course, that they recommend is that the government should cut the budget in order to cope with the level of debt that we are facing. It's to reduce its transfers to institutions such as ESCOM, such as Transnet, and the point being that you should further privatize those industries, the provision of electricity and freight railway. Uh, and this agenda, we believe, is not conducive to access to resources for disadvantaged groups, because when you privatize these industries, what it means is that the products that you get from them have to be priced according to what the market believes is the adequate price. So electricity, you will not get it unless you are able to pay for it. Water, you will not get it unless you are able to pay for it. And we know we are living in a country where a large part of the population is not able to afford these basic goods. And that's how these borrowing from these institutions affect us then on a day-to-day basis, because the government basically rubber stamps these policies and continues on them. And part of the conditions of receiving further funding is to make sure that you are continuing on these policies of austerity, of fiscal consolidation, of removing it transfers to state-owned enterprises. So secondly, these international finance institutions tend to lend in foreign currency, and sometimes the loan are in variable interest rate. So lending in foreign currency in and on itself might not be a problem if, for example, you are lending to you get a foreign currency in order to import capital goods that are necessary for the country. So you are importing machinery that will help build the manufacturing capacity of the country. But the problem we are facing is that the rand over the long term has been declining, and in the short term has been very volatile. And what it means is that it places pressure on public finances, because now what you have to repay is much more than what you had initially borrowed, because because the currency has declined so much. And the second thing is that it changes in interest rates in the context of austerity, means that money that would be reserved for socio-economic spending and realizing economic justice is then reprioritized for debt repayment. And we saw this in concrete terms in the 2023 fiscal year, where because of the decline in the value of the rand and because of an increase in interest rates, our debt repayment was much larger than expected, and it meant money which was otherwise going to be spent on education, health, and social protection was now redirected to repaying our debt. And then thirdly, the lack of accountability for these international finance institutions has allowed them to continue financing and benefiting from projects that cause harm to communities and to the environment. So there's at least two examples we can look at here. we have the Medupi example. Medupi is a power plant in Lephalale in Limpopo, which has been emitting toxic gases into the atmosphere that have had a negative impact on the communities around them. And then over the years, uh, and this construction of this power plant was financed in part by these international finance institutions. But over the years, they project which tries to reduce the level of pollution in those power plants. But over the years, they have continually delayed financing this desulfurization project. And there has been no consequence on that. Just last year, the New Development Bank was in the process of financing this project, but the loan was then cancelled. And again, there were no consequences for this. And yet it is these international finance institutions that continue to benefit in terms of loan repayment. The second is the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. So this is a project in Lesotho, and South Africa benefits considerably from this project because we are able to get water. A large part of Gauteng, for example, is able to get water from this project, and it was financed by international finance institutions. And yet, in the construction of this project and in the continued operation, there has been a displacement of people without the requisite means to move into other places or to start a new life with the requisite resources. And again, there have been no consequences that have been felt by these international finance institutions because they do not appear to be accountable to anyone. And then lastly, how they impact our
Liso,
yes.
I have a quick question here. You mentioned that these institutions they lend in foreign currency, but we know that that is a major problem, like you mentioned, because the local currency is often on a depreciating direction. So my
Yes.
question is, despite what we have seen that the debt has been growing, why do they emphasize on lending in foreign currency? Because we know that 70% of the increase in debt across Africa in 2023 has been
Mm.
attributed to the decline in foreign in local currency values.
Yes.
Why do they emphasize in lending in forex?
So part of the reason why, and this is not the full reason, but part of the reason why they continue to lend in foreign currencies, such as the dollar or the euro, is because it is believed that our local currencies in Africa and other developing countries, their value is much more fragile. Their value is much more unpredictable over the long term. So they basically want to shield themselves from currency risks. So this is why they are lending in currencies which they believe are much safer, such as the dollar and the euro.
Okay, you can go ahead. I just wanted to highlight that so that later we can see how the development issue sometimes can be compromised by the way they lend in foreign currency.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then the last thing we want to kind of look at in terms of how it impacts our lives on a day-to-day basis is that international finance institutions have been seen to be promoting a market-centered approach to the climate transition instead of, let's say, an approach that is centered that that is state-centered or that is community-centered. They have been promoting a market-centered approach. So what that means is that they have been promoting the use of, let's say, carbon markets. So carbon markets are basically a way to price pollution. It allows firms to trade it allows firms to trade the ability to pollute the atmosphere more. And then the second thing is that they're encouraging greater privatization of the electricity supply, which of course we have said was part of the conditionalities that were attached to the loan that we received from the World Bank. So that is basically the at least the four different ways in which borrowing from these international finance institutions affects our lives on a day-to-day basis and negatively impacts on our ability to to get economic justice, which we believe is a prerequisite for getting climate justice. And then the fifth point we want to make is to then draw this line more concretely. What does it mean for our ability to respond to climate change impacts and building resilience? So we are saying if lending from these international finance institutions is not on sufficiently concessional terms. So for example, if this finance is mostly in loans, which as Brighton has pointed out is increasing our debt burden, or it is in interest rates that while are lower than the market are still higher than, let's say, the growth rate of the economy. The loan financing from international finance institutions will add to the already high costs servicing our debt. What this will mean is that the government will have to take away money that would have been otherwise spent on public goods and on other ways to realize economic justice and spend it on debt repayment. What it means then is that you are not able to get what we spoke about earlier. You are not able to spend on ensuring that people have adequate housing. You are not able to spend on ensuring that there is quality and durable infrastructure to allow people to cope with the climate crisis. Instead, you spend a lot of your money on just repaying back your debt. Secondly, if the financial support that we get from international finance institutions is dependent on the continuation of this market-centered approach to the climate transition, then what happens is that the energy system will be further privatized. This will threaten the ability of a large part of the population to be able to have access, for example, to electricity. And furthermore, because a private provision of things like electricity likely means cost recovery and cost-based prices, this is likely to have the impact of increasing the price of electricity. And because electricity is such a vital input in basically most of the production processes in our economy, this may likely lead to a higher cost of living. So this is what it means for our ability to deal with the climate crisis. If this continues, we are not able to get loans on sufficiently concessional terms, and if taking on these loans means we must continue with this market-centered approach, it means we are not able to realize economic justice. And if we are not able to realize economic justice, we are not able to deal with the impacts of climate change, and we are not able to build a resilience. So what can we do then? What is it that we should be advocating in order to ensure that, yes, the climate transition is adequately financed in such a way as to encourage economic justice and climate justice? So one thing we can do is the support of domestic state-led solutions to financing the climate transition. So that will mean the use of fiscal policy. And what that means is that we must support initiatives that anti-austerity. We must support initiatives which encourage the government to spend more on realizing socio-economic rights, such as education, such as health, such as housing, such as access to land. And then secondly, uh, another avenue that is available for financing the climate transition, other than relying on these international financial institutions, is the central bank. We believe the central bank should be using its powers to provide credit that will, for example, allow for the financing of renewable energy projects. Similarly, with DFIs, development finance institutions such as the Development Bank of South Africa or the IDC. And then secondly, there should be a support for community-owned renewable energy systems. I know the comrades within the Climate Justice Coalition, this is something that they have been working on, so I would be interested to also hear from them into how we can support that kind of initiatives. And then thirdly, what we at least have been doing over the past 2 years is to try and advocate that or any finance that we get from international finance institutions must be subject to public scrutiny. So what that means is that international financial institutions loan agreements, including the policy conditionalities that we spoke about, must be freely and publicly available. Currently, they are not. And even us who were, involved in projects where we were trying to gain greater transparency or this, had to acquire these agreements through legal means because they were not publicly available. And then the second thing is that we believe any finance that is received from these institutions must be tabled and approved by Parliament with input from the public. So in this way, you are still able to have a finance that is advancing towards a climate transition, but you do not have it in a way that will impede on economic justice, which we believe will end up impeding on our ability to realize a climate justice. I think that's the presentation. Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing my screen now. You can take over, Brighton.
Thank you so much, Liso. Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. We appreciate the effort and the knowledge. I will open the floor for questions or any inputs from the attendees. So if you have a question, if you have a contribution as well, this is the time.
Brighton, perhaps while we're waiting for some questions, can we also answer I see that you answered the ones in the Q&A, but maybe Lisa also wants to come in on those.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great.
Hi, I've been unmuted. This is Penny, but is Liso going to answer some of those questions online first, or can I speak?
I think let's just allow Liso to respond to the questions that are there first, and then we can proceed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So just looking at the first question, the question, just to repeat for the attendees, is that are there usually checks and balances applied to non-project lending to make sure that the countries use the funds for positive development? So no, in general, the answer to that is no. And this is why we have been advocating for the fact that even if money is going to general budget support, so not project lending, but to the general budget support, there should be a way to track how that money has been used in order for us to be able to hold the government accountable for the use of that money. And specifically for the Just Energy Transition Project, a lot of the money that is coming from international finance institution is in the form of general budget support. So the money that we got from the World Bank is just general budget support, even though its express purpose is for to help the country towards the climate transition. We are not able to track whether that money has been used effectively, and this is the same for the money we got from the French Development Bank, the German Development Bank, and the project management unit, which is a kind of a unit within the presidency that is in charge of the just energy transition. This is something that they have said they are intending to do, to get a way in which they can track money that is coming in the form of loans, because there is already a way to track money that is coming in the form of grants. But we know grants make up a very small portion of the money that we are getting for the transition. So just to again answer the question, no, there is currently no way for us to be able to really hold the government accountable in that sense, because the money is going towards the general money that's taken up from the budget. And then the second question.
So
the second question is, you mentioned that development projects have a positive impact on a country's economy. May you please elaborate on this? So I think what I should have said is that developmental projects should have a positive impact on a country's economy. So a country, for example, for its livelihood depends on the supply of electricity. If let's say an IFI is financing projects that will help with the supply of electricity, that should be having a positive impact on the development of a country, because it allows industries to have electricity to operate, to thrive. But this is not necessarily the case. So development projects can fail if, for example, well, they can fail for many reasons. They can fail for corruption if they are not carried out completely. They can fail even in the context where, let's say, even the project is built and whatnot, but because of other factors within the country, its impact is really minimized. So yeah, in principle, these developmental projects are supposed to have a positive impact, but what the results are can depend on a variety of factors. I think Penny can come in now, unless there are any more questions on the chat. I think Penny can come in.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Liso, for this presentation. I'll give you a bit of my background, but listening to you, I kind of just warms my heart that I can see someone that's gone into this quite significantly. Perhaps still some gaps, because some of what you're talking about does not get talked about, right, which you've highlighted, right? There's non-transparency. So let me just introduce myself. My name is Penny Herbst, and I used to work at Eskom, and actually started the development finance division within Eskom in 2007. And probably a kind of a disclosure here, which I have to make. I led the World Bank negotiation on Mdutyana, and the African Development Bank negotiation, and all the other stuff in the time when Eskom was seeking to do renewables projects with the AFD, KfW, EIB, and the likes. So I've seen most of it and have been able to be in the room. And I just want to comment on that basis. But I think there's a lot more to do on this, guys, a lot more. So we can't afford to leave this where you started. Your basis here and foundation is fantastic. And I can really support you in kind of giving you some more information. But I just want to come back to a few points, and stop me, please, Brighton, if you think I'm taking too much time, and then I'll step back and we can give other people a chance. On slide 3, you talked about the current narratives of the IFIs and access to deep concessional finance. I think the access to concessional finance, or cheap, I think you call it cheap concessional finance, is a bit of a misnomer, especially when we're looking at climate change, right? We must remember that the access that we've had to finance from the likes of the MDBs, like the World Bank and the African Development, are subject to a country ceiling. So those institutions do their own analysis and say, okay, we can only do so much and we can't do any more. And actually the African Development Bank's lending to South Africa is kind of quite constrained. And there are other structures that are being put into place in the background to try and achieve a bit more leverage. So that cheap concessional finance or cheap finance being limited with this billions to trillions leveraging the multilaterals to bring on private sector, it has such a minute impact given the quantum of finance we need now. We can hardly continue with a conversation that looks like this, that says we've got cheap finance and we're going to leverage billions to trillions. And you can see the narrative out there at the moment. Actually, this billions to trillions narrative is changing and people are saying it didn't work, but yet we're still going down the same track. The government's still doing it, the PMU is still looking at it, and I don't think that, and you've noted this, the transparency and the governance and the guardrails around this are absolutely non-existent. I've tried to point this out, even back to National Treasury, back to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee. Consultation processes in this country are non-existent. It's a question of putting it out there, and then if you've been in the room, great, you've made your comments, but we're not going to take your comments into account. So I think there's another bit of this, part of this, because we also as a country are allowing these processes just to be steamrolled without it. And we've already gone down a really slippery track already. So that's my one point. Your point on privatization, I absolutely, having been in the room 2009 and 10, I know exactly kind of the push to get the energy sector privatized. And it's ongoing. It's definitely ongoing. And if you have a look at some of those loan agreements that have been put in place, again, there's a lot that doesn't get said, right? Even in that letter on the IMF, there's a lot behind it that will be in other documents that we won't see. So transparency, definitely not there. I think my biggest problem, and some of my colleagues and people that I speak to will know me, I keep on asking, but guys, can we just please understand what is the revenue model? The PMU can talk about it's $8 billion, it's $12 billion. I've asked, I said, but guys, what's the revenue model? No, we don't have a revenue model. We're getting this money, but we do not know how we're going to pay it. You will not see it in any of the budget reviews. You will not see it anywhere because, and conveniently, the piece that's missing, this piece of the World Bank, remember that the World Bank has got what it calls a preferred creditor status, PCS, right? And that preferred creditor status says that you will pay us first, so before you pay anybody else. And if you don't pay us, the consequences are you get cut off from every single bit of finance and financing that you are able to access. I mean, this preferred creditor status is quite significant. And then you've got to understand why the World Bank and the likes of those institutions keep that there. Because the credit, if you go and look at the credit ratings of these institutions, they are AA or AAA, World Bank AAA, because they have preferred credit status, and it's just too difficult to contemplate not paying back those loans. If you talk about the RAND exposure, right, I headed up currency risk management at Eskom right from the start when we had access to capital markets. So I go back a long way. And if you look at it from a state-owned enterprise in South Africa, Eskom has a requirement to cover all its foreign currency exposure. So you cannot have it open. And you haven't talked about, but I'm sure there hasn't been enough time about that kind of how do you deal with that foreign exchange exposure. What I do want to point to, just in a bit of a segue, a good example of a pushback from a country on foreign exchange exposure is Ethiopia, where the World Bank, the private sector of the World Bank, tried to get Ethiopia to sign up to a risk mitigation mechanism where they would basically sign off and say, well, you know, we're signing up to this and we'll be able to repay. And the government said, but guys, we don't have enough foreign currency. We can't access the foreign currency. Why would we sign up to this? And the project that the other IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, actually got cancelled. I've made a bit of I've had a discussion on this thing as well, but this thing continues. So when you talk about finance as well, and this is another point I wanted to make, it's not just finance. There's a lot, guys, behind the credit risk mechanism. So the partial risk guarantees, the partial credit guarantees, the meagres of this world that we're not paying attention to. And here I want to highlight, sorry guys, and you can stop me because I think I'm speaking a bit too much. This credit rating mechanism that the electricity minister keeps on talking together with National Treasury about. We're not even in the room to be able to actually understand. And we've got people working on it that do not have enough experience, right, of what goes into those, because the devil of in the detail is what gets put into those contractual agreements. And you have to be extremely astute to actually understand what you're signing up for. So that's really important. The other misnomer we have in this country on, and just generally on financial markets, and I'm not in favor of this privatization drive, by the way, the narrative always is, oh, we're going to make this off balance sheet. If you're putting in public purpose infrastructure, guys, someone has to pay. Again, come back to the revenue model. Where is the revenue model and how are we going to have to pay? So, and I would like to go into the detail on the renewable energy and the privatization and all of that. There's not going to be enough time, but I would like to engage with you guys a bit further on this. Now, I think find my final comment. Tracking and disclosures after the fact is far too late. So you've mentioned on, you know, track, for instance, some of the World Bank stuff and try and get it. You can't afford to say once that agreement has been signed, especially with the IFIs, this is a political agreement that's been signed at the top level. There is no ways that you're going back on that because that's going to be considered a default on some of the loan conditions. So, and just let me tell you, in 2009-10, when I started working on the World Bank loan, there was a push from the World Bank to do a development policy loan. The DPLs that this government has been signing up for since 2020, right? That we keep on just seeing them pop up in the budget review, and that list getting longer and longer. And it's interesting to know that loan, even though we worked on it for a year, never got as far as Parliament because it was pushed back on somewhere behind in the political structures. So it got stopped. And we had to actually change track and work on a special project loan, which then became the Mdutyana loan, right? So I think in that respect, if you're having a look at kind of putting those development policy loans together, I'm wondering where did we go wrong as a country, which allowed in the 2009-10s the ability to have something stopped before it got there to where we are now. And I'm just going to kind of throw something out there. When we started working on the World Bank loan, from an Eskom point of view, we knew we needed a lot of money, right? And the development finance was kind of one of the easier ones to address. And I'm not saying it was easy because it took 3 years to put together. And I suspect that there's a narrative somewhere that this is an easy one to do, guys. Because let's face it, there's a whole lot of people that are sitting and they're all transactionalists. It's all about the transaction. Sorry if I'm sounding a bit like Trump, but it is all in the transaction. And in the transaction, people just kind of work. I was there myself, guys. I'm speaking from experience. It's kind of, we've got to get this done, got to get this done, got to get this done. I see it in the PMU, I see it in the presidency, I see it all over. We've got to get it done. It's in our KPIs. Even yesterday, when we listened to OV2 that was presented, this Operation Lela, Rudy was saying, oh, but it's in my compact. If I don't get this done, I won't have a job. Okay, well, let's start thinking about who's paying who and who's allowing that to happen. I was like, I listened to this, I thought, but actually, guys, you're working for us. Where is the us in the room? Anyway, so I'm just I've got a whole lot of notes on my book, but I'm going to stop there. And thank you very much for listening to me and giving me the opportunity and not stopping me too soon. Thank you, Brighton, and thank you so much, Liso. You've done a wonderful job.
Thank you so much for such. I sense the passion. I think you mentioned quite a lot of issues that are around finance, and I think we will follow up because I know there's a lot of details. You spoke about the extent of how concessional the finance is. You spoke about the quantum. You spoke about the currency exposure. You spoke about the issue of privatization. You spoke about issue of transparency. I think there's quite a lot that we can go in detail on. I think we will follow up and make sure that we have a more detailed discussion around that. Liso, I'm just going to allow you to respond to Courtney on the question that is on the question answer chat there.
Okay. So the question is, for the general budget support, there is no way to track it as the public, but is there a reporting process to the donor country or the lender country, whatever it may be? Is there a way we could ask for those to be made public, maybe? So, what I'm aware of is that many of these, well, not all, many of the international finance institutions have these, what are they called? I might be forgetting the term, but it's essentially a mechanism whereby the public or people affected by certain types of thing can complain. So it's independent accountability mechanism, something like that. So there are typically with these international finance institutions those avenues whereby someone that is concerned or someone or a group of people that have been affected by the financing of whether that be project or general budget support can complain, but that's one avenue. I think we would have to look at others in terms of the international finance institutions. I'm not aware of any other kind of effective way to complain to the donor or to the lending institution. Which is why kind of our approach has been to focus on the borrower country, which is South Africa, and say we must have a way to hold you accountable for taking this finance that affects us as the public in this manner.
Thank you, Liso. I hope, Courtney, you have been answered. Yeah, I just want to comment as well. I think there's been a lot of emphasis on borrowing from international finance institutions. And I don't think that there has been enough effort to look at, locally and see how we can mobilize resources, internally. I think there's quite a number of instruments that we can include, for example, issue of green bonds locally. We have a lot of finance that is tied up in the fossil fuels, and the source being pension funds. We also have an option of looking at carbon pricing. I think is debatable, but I think we need to have a discussion on that. And I also understand that the new development bank has been issuing finance in local currency. So I would be interested in having a discussion on some of the instruments that we can evaluate so that there's domestic resource mobilization, because we can clearly see that getting loans from external sources is genuinely unsustainable. The statistics are indicating that the debt will increase further than the 75.1 that is currently there. So I think we need to look at internally and see how we can get the finance, because the time is running out for us to react to the climate crisis. Tara?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that there's a question from Monica in the chat. the question is, what does public input mean in case of a country borrowing from international institutions? I think this is maybe in reference, Liso, to the kind of what can we do, and the suggestion that we get more public input. Yeah, from your last slide, the suggestion of public input into borrowing decisions from.
Yes. Yes, I can try and answer that. So the first thing to note is that in the budget. So borrowing is part of the budget, obviously, and already that the final kind of deciding body is Parliament, and the Parliament has the room for public input. And in principle, the public is supposed to be, or Parliament rather, should be consulted about these decisions to borrow, because they form part of the annual borrowing plan. We see them in the budget review and whatnot. But currently, the law allows for the Minister of Finance to sign these loan agreements on their own discretion without reporting to Parliament. It's in the law. So what we have calling for is that before these loan agreements are signed, they must be tabled, or at least before the debt is taken up by the country, they should be tabled before Parliament, so that they can be scrutinized effectively, not only by the members of Parliament, but by the public as well, because there are avenues for the public to participate in parliamentary debates. And we have been doing this for the last 2 years. So it's been us as a collection of civil society organizations, as well as a few trade union federations. What we have been trying is to get essentially a law put in place which says that the country cannot take on any more debt from these international finance institutions unless it is approved by Parliament, and is available, the loan agreement contracts are available publicly, so that anyone can make an assessment, and yeah. So that's what, public participation would involve. It would be through the parliamentary mechanism.
Thank you, Liso.
Sorry, Brighton. I think Penny also gave an answer to the question that was asked earlier as to how the public can essentially advocate towards or complain towards the lending institutions or the donor institutions. So she's referring to the World Bank, the accountability mechanism. Yeah. People can have a look at that in the chat.
Okay. Thank you so much, Liso. I'm still waiting for any comments, any additions, any questions as well. We still have a couple of minutes here on our clock.
I have a few questions of my own, but I will prioritize participant questions, and then if there aren't any, then I will come in.
I see Alex has his hand raised.
Yes, Alex, you can proceed.
All right, hopefully folks can hear me. Thanks so much, Brighton and Liso. This is very helpful. I'm thinking, with obviously all the problems with international finance institutions, with the likes of the US cutting funding that was going to go towards things like the Just Energy Transition Partnership. And then, of course, we have our own fiscal crisis with our government of national unity being unable to agree to a budget. And certainly seems like they're going to be cutting things. I'm just wondering what the prospects are for progressive tax reform, and why this seems to be off the table for our government. things like taxing the wealthy, progressive taxation, resource rent, extraction taxes. I think Kasatu put together a nice proposal around this, but I don't know if Kasatu is really fighting for it, given their role in the tripartite alliance. So yeah, I don't know. Just a question around the prospects for that, and whether we should be pushing for this. Thanks for this.
Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead,
Yeah,
Brighton?
I just want to make a quick comment. I would love to acknowledge some of the colleagues from Institute of Economic Justice. They have a paper that tables some of these options, including some of the tools that I mentioned. So I'm happy that there's some work around that, but I think we just need to come together and make sure that we amplify some of the solutions and make some proposals, to the systems and say, these are options that we can, explore. Why are we not doing enough around that? Thank you. Liso?
Thanks. Yeah, again, I would say I echo all of your sentiments, Brighton. We have done a lot of work around these progressive tax reforms, such as wealth tax, other taxation, for example, the trading of financial assets, which we think is a possible source of revenue, resource rent tax, but I don't think it's for a lack of absence of these options, as you have noted them, or a lack of organizations that maybe speak about these options. It's probably my feeling is that it's a political problem. I don't think from the side of civil society and labor, there has been a sufficient coordination of a push to ensure that these reforms are realized, and that's probably what is needed, some sort of political action that will ensure that those that are in power, those that are able to ultimately make those decisions, feel the pressure and are encouraged to basically take them up. It's definitely not for a lack of work around these. A lot of institutions have done work around progressive tax reform. It's a question possibly of strategy and a political action, I think.
Thank you, Liso. Alex, do you have anything else to add? Maybe response?
No, that's good. Thanks, comrade.
Okay.
I think it is a political strategy. So you've got to deepen that. Thanks.
Okay.
You are muted, Comrade Brighton.
Thank you for that. You can visit also the website for Institute of for Economic Justice. They do have quite a lot of resources and a lot of work that they have done that we can explore together. Any further questions? Tara, can you assist if there's any questions that I don't see in the
I
chat?
think Tara also had questions and comments if we are not getting anything else.
Right.
Should I come in or?
Yes, proceed. Okay. I see there's another question from Sepo Madiba, but let's start with you, Tara, then we can proceed.
Okay. I mean, Liso, thanks so much for this presentation. So important that we're talking about these things. And I think when we were discussing this in the early stages, we also wanted to prioritize kind of focusing on a general understanding of what are international finance institutes and kind of demystifying them. So there were just a few terms that I think it would be good for you to just expand a little bit on. One of them was around this idea of fiscal consolidation, because I think that really ties for those who are joining us from within South Africa. I think most people are. The context, the context of the budget, the current budget that's being contested, and the proposal of the VAT increase that was then pulled off the table. So maybe just tying this back to the conversation of how does the accumulation of debt link to our day-to-day lived experiences? It would be good to just expand a bit about, like, in the layman's terms, what does fiscal consolidation actually mean? And then maybe just another comment or addition to the conversation around, when we are talking about climate justice, this point that's commonly raised is around the historic debt that the global north owes the global south. So I guess, for the global north, they see their banks as they have like development banks as these like safe mechanisms or palatable mechanisms to provide or address that historic debt. And of course, from your presentation, it's very clear that doesn't work to address historic debt and injustices that have been perpetuating climate injustice. But then, do you have any suggestions on potential mechanisms that might work? Are there mechanisms for channeling finances? So you gave a few examples of how to track and ensure that the finance is transparent and the loan agreements are transparent. But are there other mechanisms that you can think of or that you might know of? And I know that this might be a bit of a it's also fine if that's outside of this conversation. And then my final question was just maybe if you know off the top of your head, within South Africa's history of borrowing, what are the major areas that we have borrowed historically? So I think you mentioned energy, you mentioned the water project, although that that seemed to be with Lesotho, but I wasn't sure if the South African government was also involved in that, or whether that was just through the DVSA. But yeah, so if you could give an overview of the different major areas of where we have historically borrowed, and like where the larger areas of debt are coming from. Yeah, those are the questions that I have.
Liso, can you talk with it?
Sorry, can I go ahead?
Yes, Liso. Go ahead.
Okay. So just to answer the first question, so if fiscal consolidation essentially means we must tighten our belts. That's really it. So it is usually a concept that comes up when a country is very highly indebted, and there's a push that in order to contain this debt, the government must reduce its spending. Because, for example, maybe it is not able to get in more revenue, so it must reduce its spending in order to cut the difference between the revenue and the expenditure. So that is typically one of the requirements or what is prescribed to countries that are facing a debt problem, which South Africa is. But South Africa's debt problem is it's of a different nature in our opinion, because we believe that the main contributing factor is the high cost of borrowing, which is not just a result of the high level of debt. But yeah, if fiscal consolidation is basically that. It's that you must, for example, increase taxes in order to increase the revenue, while not doing anything to expenditure, or you must cut expenditure in order, again, to cut the gap between what the government gets and what it spends. And then the second question, I think, was around the areas of borrowing. So over the years, South Africa has typically, so by that I mean in the last, let's say, 30 years, they have not borrowed considerably from international finance institutions. In fact, in the 90s, they had kind of resisted deliberately from taking on money from institutions such as the IMF and especially the IMF because of concerns around what it would mean for the country's policy sovereignty, for the ability of the country to make its decisions on its own. They had kind of resisted that for the longest time. But over the years, especially in the 2000s, we had taken money from the World Bank, but this was mainly for conservation projects, environment conservation. That was most of the lending during that time from the World Bank. Then there was the big loan, obviously, for the construction of Medupi. And then just going back to IFIs in general has been a much more recent phenomenon where we have now the French and the German Development Bank has been a phenomena of the JET, Just Energy Transition Partnership kind of period. So that's the areas of general borrowing. It's been around energy and a little around conservation, environmental conservation. And then the last question, actually, Tara, I don't think I got it well, where you were asking about what other means exist for. I wasn't sure about the question. I don't think I understood you correctly. Could you just repeat that one?
Yeah, sure. I see that Anda has in the chat has a similar question. It's a question around, there's this conversation around climate reparations and the historic debt that the global north owes the global south. So if we're not what do you have any ideas of alternative approaches to or mechanisms to transfer that, to make up for that debt and that responsibility?
So in addition to the ones you've already mentioned, which I think are good ways to account for that historical debt that's owed, one channel which I strongly believe in is debt cancellation. I think debt cancellation could be an effective mechanism. So that is us saying we will not repay back the historical debt that we owe that has been lent by whether that be private investors or international finance institutions or whatnot. So that's another avenue that would free up the space for countries to actually spend their money rather than trying to repay back the debt that they have taken on historically. So that's just one other avenue. I think others can suggest as well.
Okay, thank you, Liso. Tara, have you been answered?
Yeah, I think so. I maybe just to clarify, I wasn't talking necessarily in terms of, I think this word in the climate space is like the climate debt is not necessarily like in relation to a loan, but more like that the global north has accumulated like a moral debt, and that there's a moral responsibility for the global north to bear the greatest burden of financial costs and I think that's what I, just to clarify what I meant there by climate debt. But I think your answer covered that. Yeah.
Okay.
I think I see a question on the chat.
Yeah.
No, not on the chat, on the Q&A actually. So
Yeah.
the question is from Tsepo is, does this mean that the Minister of Finance has sole decision making on loan agreements without proper oversight protocols from Parliament or its subcommittees? Yes, Tsepo, it means precisely that that the minister has sole decision making power on loan agreements in the current legal framework, which is why we are saying we have been fighting for the introduction of a bill which will qualify the powers that the Minister of Finance has being the sole decision maker on things like that. So what was a bit different, especially for the loans that were taken from for the COVID-19 pandemic recovery, is that I think the World Bank and the IMF loan were tabled before cabinet and were approved by cabinet. But other than that, there is no other oversight over the taking on of loans from international finance institutions. The minister has these inordinate powers to do so, which must be qualified.
Thank you, Liso. I just wanted to check quickly. Can you just look at Anda's question there? Hasn't it been covered in regards to the climate debt that Tara was referring to before we move to Courtney's?
Sorry, what's the question, Bright?
There's a question on the chat from
On the chat.
Anda. Yeah, in regards to reparations. I'm just checking, hasn't that been covered around the issue of climate debt?
Oh, so this the specific question itself is not my line of work. But in general, we have been in support of climate reparations as one of the means to finance the climate transition by the global north. So yes, we have been in support of that, yes. I can't give you the specific details. I can refer you to some of the papers that have been written which speak to ways of financing the climate transition, which do speak about climate reparations as one of the means. So we are in support of that.
Thank you, Liso. Anda, do you have any contribution around that, if possible? Anda? Okay, no response from Anda. But I would love to get your contribution because it seems as if you were particularly asking for the Institute's stance on climate reparations, but you might have some different viewpoints as well. Would love to hear that. Then moving on to Courtney, she's asking from the legal perspective that do we have a basis for us to challenge some of this funding using the legal frameworks? And the second part is asking how the Climate Change Act can assist us. Liso, do you have insight on that?
So the first question is there a legal basis for us to challenge some of this funding using our legal frameworks in this country? So with I can speak specifically on the issue of international finance institutions in terms of their financing. So there is a reading of the loan agreements that are signed between the state and international finance institutions as international treaties. So there is a legal basis for us to say those are international treaties. And if that is the case, then there is already existing law which says that international treaties must be approved by Parliament, which would again allow for more effective scrutiny. So that's one legal basis for that. Then the second question is, how does the Climate Change Act help us? If there are any lawyers in the room, I think we might need the lawyers in the room specifically for that question. Yeah.
Anyone in the room who can assist? In regards to the legal frameworks? Anyone willing to come in?
Hi, Brighton.
Sure.
Yeah, I think my question would also have an element of what is trying to ask. Because we do have the public finance, which is one of the tools the government.
Sepo, your line is a bit unclear.
Let me just
If possible, we can drop the question in the chat. Thank you. I think I will allow Penny to come in now. Penny, you got some comments?
Yes, I do. With regard to this fiscal consolidation, in 2020, just kind of on the basis of kind of understanding why we as a country didn't want to go down that route, very much that was the case in 2010 when I remember I said to you it sort of didn't even get to Parliament, it sort of got stopped, even though there was a lot of work that had been done on this World Bank Development Policy loan. But again, if one has a look at, I think this progressive tax and the VAT, and this is, I'm just kind of putting 2 and 2 together, and hopefully I'm not coming up with 5, is that the minister actually a week or 2 ago in his address to the media on reversing the VAT decision, you could hear, from his comments that he was not happy. And in the same breath, he said that we might soon be going to the IMF as a result of the VAT not going up. And having researched kind of the VAT issue in numerous countries, I have my suspicions that VAT increase was really based on some of the conversations with the IMF and the World Bank. It's not out there, but listening to it and the nuances, that I have, I have my doubts as to kind of where it all came from. So, and I think it's well worth having a look at that, to be honest, because you won't see it, but you might see it in the wording of the loans. But just to get back to this conversation that you've been having on not repaying the debt, I think one has to really look at that not repaying some of the debt, and use maybe Zambia as an example that's just gone through this debt negotiation process where there's a clear, maybe split 3 ways, different types of debt. One being the multilateral debt, right, which I've said, if we're going into a World Bank loan, there is no possibility to cancel that debt, none whatsoever. I don't think there ever will be, because that immediately, and it's not that I'm supporting credit rating agencies' methodologies and processes, will affect the AAA credit rating. It will immediately affect it, because that's how they're keeping it. I mean, if you just think about it from the way credit rating agencies work in the credit rating kind of environment, it's kind of what does that country look like as a creditworthy entity, and by putting a whole lot of uncreditworthy entities together, that doesn't necessarily. And I'm saying uncreditworthy countries or entities. I'm saying that lightly because I question how they assess that, right? So that's a different conversation altogether. So there would have to be a lot of discussions on that. But what I want to bring in as a separate as two specific issues. One, when we talk about the different multilaterals and IFIs, you've also further got to go and have a look. I saw on your list that you mentioned the World Bank and you mentioned the AFD, not KfW, but you've talked about them. But if you then start having a look at other development financing institutions, IFIs, and you go and analyze the JET, you get the British coming in, right, through the BII, and the US that's no longer there through the DFC. Those you've got to start unpacking, guys, because they're a completely different animal. They're basically saying, aside from the little bits of grant money that we're sprinkling around to kind of as fairy dust, we really want to see our private sector DFI accessing this space. So when you go and analyze the JET, And the JET PM use processes, which I'd also like to put down here as well, doesn't help the JET having what are they calling it, a platform, and that platform is transparent, because again, it's all after the fact. The money that the British are going to give for the private sector is going to go back to British entities, and you're going to see it. You're going to see it very clearly. So I think that's another thing that one really has to start looking at, and potentially other contributions from other countries. I can't say it's not going to work.
Just to say, Penny, we have already seen it. So part of
Yeah.
the money that came in from BII, British International Investment, has gone into a company called Globelec, which is owned by
Yes.
the UK government. So
Yes.
we are already seeing that exactly.
We can have another discussion about Globelec and Uganda and Umemi, which I worked on as well, and was, I've had a lot of different kind of interesting experiences. All right, and again, a kind of one doesn't have to, we can talk about the company. People that work there can be quite nice sometimes. But anyway, they've got an agenda, they've got a kind of agenda to work on. I mean, I know Globelec, for instance, even before it went to the Just Energy Transition Office, had made announcements, and I've still kept track of those, that when they got awarded the battery energy storage project in the Northern Cape, they immediately came out and said, we're using the Just Transition funds for a government awarded tender. And I'm like, oh my goodness, they are this in your face about the fact that this is a government tender, and we're getting the money that we've given you for the jet energy transaction, and we're taking it back out. I mean, that for me is, I don't know, I'm expecting a lot from you guys, right, as the Institute for Economic Justice. I mean, this is all very good and well, guys, sorry, that we're talking about this here. But if we can't action what we're talking about, and this is my concern, and I'd like to really raise it to you and everybody else that's in the room, how does one get from talk to action? And that is a big challenge. And I think, an entity like the Institute for Economic Justice has the relationships with a broader sector of civil society and others. I think it really is really incumbent on yourselves to start looking. Sorry, I don't want to tell you what to do, but it's really important to have a look at that. The other point I want to make, just a big point, but I'll address it very lightly. In this privatization, where we have the financialization of the energy industry or the electricity supply chain and value chain. We talk about unbundling Eskom, but now we're letting a whole lot of other entities into the space, which have throughout the value chain interests, right? They might be an IPP, they're a trader, they might also, like for instance, some of the banks also have investments in traders, they're providing debt. So, and we don't know, we don't have any insight into that. So the potential for conflicts of interest within this new space are huge, number one. The minister talks about electricity prices coming down. Let me just say right now on this talk, electricity prices are not coming down. The way the industry has been structured now, there's no chance. It's going up. And my big question that I have that keeps me awake at night is, what type of investors, if we kind of have to go down an FDI route, right? What type of investors do we want to see in this country? What do we want from them? What would we like to see as a return to the country? And we're not having a deep conversation on that because it's all over the place. It's a free for all, and we haven't had this deep conversation, especially in the light of going back now to my early days at Eskom, where when we once sought finance, it was from the bond markets, right? So Eskom got its money from the bond market. That's it. It had a huge bond desk, got the money, and kind of did what it needed to do with it. What we have now is the bond markets playing a much smaller role. IFIs playing a bigger role initially with this narrative of leveraging money from billions to trillions, but that we're not going past that billions to the trillion part to understand. Are we eager to have private equity here? My answer would be absolutely not. But we've seen it. We've already seen Actis, who, by the way, was the entity that worked on Umemi that I kind of got to understand very well because they transformed from Globelec to Actis. And they were investors in the first bid round, right? Getting huge tariffs for those first rounds. And they've sold their assets. They sold their assets to someone else. We never questioned who they're getting sold to. Are we happy with the new ones? Were we happy with the first ones? how much in this value chain is being sucked out that we've got to pay for as consumers? And then obviously the split of, private sector being able to access the most creditworthy consumers, which is happening now, and the rest, unfortunately will have to go to Eskom, who has a huge debt burden. And I still don't believe, even though National Treasury is saying that they are a going concern, given all the other challenges that they have. So where are we as civil society? Where are we able to, with significant amount of knowledge and ability to question things, why and why aren't we in the room? Why? And I'd love to hear from you on this specific. On you, Brighton and Liso, why aren't we? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penny. I can sense the passion, and thank you so much for the contributions. I think some of the questions that you're posing are very important questions that, what is our stance? What is our role? What are we doing? I think this platform was created so that we end up having solutions to say, us as the civil society, how can we come together, discuss these problems, discuss the solutions, and table some of these solutions to the authorities. Before we proceed, I think I'm just going to give the platform to Into Meleng, from Center for Environmental Rights. Do you have any comments in regards to the legal frameworks in relation to the question that was posed by Courtney? Any initial response? Thank you.
Hi, Brighton, Liso, and everybody. My name is Mdutyana from the Center for Environmental Rights. Not from the top of my head. I think it's something that we need to look into, research, and hopefully get back to the group, but not specifically right now from the top of my head.
Thank you for that. At least we are moving towards something. So I think, Courtney, we will all get a response in regards to that. I think there's one more question from, actually there are two questions from Tsepo Madiba. Do you mind if you check that, Liso?
Yes.
Trying to find a way to wrap.
Okay. The first question is the PFMA not broad enough to serve as a tool for administering such funds? So currently it is not, because of the way it specifically deals with the issue of loan agreements from international finance institutions. So it has a very specific way in which it deals with them. I'll just read a section from you. So section 72 of the Public Finance Management Act says, the Minister of Finance, on conditions determined by the Minister of Finance, may authorize another person to sign a loan agreement when the Minister of Finance borrows in terms of section 66 2A of the PMFA. So currently that allows basically the Minister of Finance to have discretion as to signing the loan agreements and the contents of the deciding whether the contents of the loan agreements are correct or appropriate for the country. And then this links to your other question. And doesn't the unilateral decision-making powers of the minister in this regard in a way circumvent the PFMA? I'm not a lawyer, but my sense is that yes, there is a way in which it is against the spirit of the PMFA, which envisions Parliament as ultimately the supervising institution over the decisions that are taken on by the Ministry of Finance. So there is a way in which it kind of circumvents that. I will say in spirit because I'm not a lawyer. I cannot say further on this, but definitely it goes against the spirit of parliamentary oversight.
Thank you, Liso. I think we're almost at the end of our time here. I would like to thank everyone who participated, everyone who took time to take part in this conversation. Thank you so much to Climate Justice Coalition. Thank you
Sorry, Brighton.
Yes,
Maybe
listen.
after that, you can also read what Utara wrote on the chat. I'm not sure if you saw.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I think she's just referring that she's saying thank you everyone for the engagement today in the webinar. Just to note that we are hoping to have another discussion and more in-depth discussions. So stay tuned and keep the energy and the engagement. I think she's just mentioning that. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking part. Thank you so much, Liso, for the time sacrifice. It was a lot of time, a lot of meetings in preparation for this. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Shazia. Thank you to the entire team from Climate Justice Coalition for this webinar. I think what is clear is that there's a lot of elements that we need to discuss and a lot of issues that we need to tackle. As civil society, we must come together around issues of finance to look at some of the obvious issues and some that are less apparent as well, so that we come up with solutions. I think our time is up. If there's any other issues, I think we can contact Tara and Shazia to move forward. And we look forward to the other discussions and webinars as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
So much. Thank you so much. Thanks, Brighton.
Great.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Bye.